There are no good horror films anymore. This is a quote from the comment section of a video I watched a little while ago. A video talking about the latest entry into the Saw franchise, Spiral, from the Book of Saw. And it got me thinking, are there no good horror films anymore? My immediate response was, of course there are. There must be. The more I considered it though, the more I thought the topic was debatable. Firstly, it's a subjective statement. It's all about opinion. Good cannot be a universal thing. We all have different stands for what is or isn't good. So simply put, there is no answer to this statement. There is no right or wrong. But how do I examine this and see if it's true? I mean, what's the time frame here? Are we talking the 80s, the 90s, or just the past few years? I think it's less about horror films not being good anymore and more about changing the face of horror. In other words, horror films today are not the same as horror films of previous years or generations. What's scary, what's horrific, and so on has changed. Even more specifically, how those elements are presented has changed, to an extent. Horror goes through trends. In the 80s we had slasher movies. In the 90s we had more comedic horrors. In the 90s we had torture porn. In the 2010s we had paranormal and found footage horrors. Yes, there were overlaps here and there, but these were the major horror themes and styles and approaches of each of those generations. So, we're now in the 2020s and we have, I don't know, socially and politically aware horror? Is that a thing? Is that a way of phrasing it? What I'm trying to say is we have horrors that are less about gore and violence and jump scares and more about ideas, ideals and concepts. Sometimes we throw in the gore, the violence and the jump scares just for good measure. Bottom line, horror has always reflected the time period in which it was made, especially now. Torture porn, for example, was particularly brought upon because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, specifically the revelations about torture or enhanced interrogation that went on during that time period. Now, horror is inspired by various social movements and trends. Racism, politics, war, homophobia, transphobia, all of these elements are pretty dominant themes and concerns right now, and as such, horror is taking them and showing them in a way that's easier to consume and understand. Get Out, for example, the feature film directorial debut of Jordan Peele, looks at ideas around racism, how certain people are still racist even if they don't know it, and how there are real people living in real lives in fear because of it. Get Out works well because it has something to say, it has powerful themes and messages, and to top it off, it's presented in an entertaining fashion. Of course there's some exaggeration and fantasy mixed in, but that helps make the subjects more accessible. Get Out was also nominated for Academy Awards. Look at the history of horror movies. They never really get award consideration, not unless you go back several decades. Is Get Out good though? It's well crafted, it's got everything it takes to be a good film, but is it a good horror? Can a horror film be good if it's not scary? Get Out is sometimes considered a thriller. Does this mean it fails? Does this mean it's not a good horror film? Who knows? Again, so much of this is subjective, there is no answer. All I can say is that I enjoyed Get Out. I think it's a good film, regardless of how scary I found it. But in relation to this, I'm white. Get Out really explores the viewpoint of a black man in America, suffering from horrid racism. So here's a question I cannot possibly answer, but I am going to ask, just out of curiosity. Is Get Out a scarier film for black viewers, rather than white viewers like myself? Are the themes and topics of this film way more relevant and impactful to black audiences than white ones? And if so, is it a good film or a good horror movie because of this? Because I would probably have to guess, yeah. Another recent horror film is Midsommar, from writer and director Ari Aster. Here, a group of tourists heads to Europe travelling in an attempt to get out of one of their past relationships. This is an interesting horror film to say the least. Firstly, it subverts certain expectations by being set primarily at daytime. It also lacks a clear antagonist or any clear conflict for a large amount of time, meaning a lot of the horror of this film comes from suspense, a sense of uneasiness, and of course, some creepy, weird characters. This is a horror film that lacks much in the way of jump scares, violence and gore, although it does have them to a certain extent. Where this film succeeds as a horror is in its tone and atmosphere. The fact that we know there's something uneasy and odd about the group of friends are with is a good example. It takes a while before our fears and curiosities about certain individuals and groups comes true. when the horror starts to come to fruition and we start to see just what is going on, the idea of what is happening and the fact that certain people show little acknowledgement of how horrific it is what makes this film scary. Now, is Midsommar a good horror film? Again, subjective, so very debatable. It has scary elements for sure, but the film also has some flaws like its length and pacing. Can elements like that prevent a film from being good? On a technical level, yes. For the sake of this discussion, let's ignore my film studies education and try and look at things like an average moviegoer. Midsommar is an epic scale, slow burn indie art house horror. Those words are important because let's face it, Hollywood horror is pretty different. It's much more rapid and in your face with an emphasis on excitement and instant gratification. That doesn't make this or those films bad or worse, just different. Midsommar is a film that paces its horror. It doesn't always try to scare its viewers, but it's always preparing them and it's always building up to the scares. But let's talk about a more mainstream Hollywood horror film, one with a bigger budget and more of an entertainment goal. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. This is the 8th in the franchise and the 3rd to have the Conjuring name. Here, paranormal experts Ed and Lorraine Warren need to prove the existence of demons in order to help a man avoid jail time, or worse, when he is possessed during a killing. This is a much faster paced film than Midsommar or Get Out. If a comedy film is all about giving you as many laughs as possible, as quick as possible, this is about giving you something scary as often as they can, even if it means repeating itself or lacking in originality. As a franchise film, the 3rd Conjuring movie feels very familiar, with story beats, unsettling characters, mood lighting and jump scares all over the place, just like prior entries into the series. Now, none of these elements make it bad. In fact, it makes the 3rd Conjuring pretty enjoyable, and dare I say, fun. This is a horror film that is focused on entertaining its audience over sending powerful messages or telling a depth-filled, detailed story or character examination. Again, not better or worse, simply different. The fact that these films were all released in recent years shows that in mainstream horror, there's diversity in the way horror is presented. There isn't a key set of rules that all these films follow. Look further out, look at the world cinema. The films coming out of South Korea, crime dramas from Scandinavia with dark, twisted elements, big budget movies, small budget movies. There are tons of horror films out there. There are some playing around with style and concept, like Don't Breathe, where the antagonist is a blind man who is hunting his prey. There is torture porn still, filled with gore and violence like Spiral. There's paranormal stuff like the Conjuring movies, more unsettling character stuff like Saint Maud, and some blending of genres like Underwater, which has science fiction elements. There are horror films out there for everyone, and not everyone will like them, obviously. So, are there good horror films these days? That's the big question. Yes, clearly there are, and the initial quote I took for this discussion was probably not meant to be taken literally. But if it was literal, then I have to say you must look around. Horror is presented in all shapes and sizes, with different languages and scopes. If you're disappointed with the horror coming out of Hollywood, check out some South Korean horror. If that doesn't float your boat, look at smaller budget things like Saint Maud, coming from the UK. There are good horror films these days, they just aren't always getting the attention they deserve. Why is that? Well, that's a whole other topic we don't really have time for today, but to put it simply, horror is scary. Not everyone likes being scared, so not everyone watches horror movies. There's also the way the films are made. Horror is mostly, but not always, low budget, so sometimes lacks the finesse of some other genres. Not always, but sometimes. Anyway, there are good horrors, just not always in the places you want them to be. Do some research, look around, they're there, I promise you, and you might be scared when you find them. But anyway, that's my little mini essay thing, I suppose you would call it, on horror movies. Yes, there are good horror movies these days. If you've liked this video, subscribe to my channel to get more content like this. If you haven't, go away, I don't care. In the meantime, subscribe to my channel, like I just said, follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @the_Grant Burton, and thanks for watching.